Good evening, friends, and welcome. I'm Laura Gonzalez, the Education and Volunteer Manager here at El Rancho de las Golondrinas, a living history museum situated in the beautiful and historic La Cienega Valley, just south of Santa Fe, New Mexico. I'm excited to introduce our 2021 Speaking of Traditions virtual winter lecture series, co-hosted with the New Mexico Museum of Art and sponsored by New Mexico Humanities Council. We invite you to join us for 3 enlightening Facebook Live events that will explore the often overlooked connection and interplay between history, the environment, and the resulting cultural landscapes that preserve our heritage. The first talk this evening, Fire Ghosts, Climate Change in Our Cultural Landscape, is presented by our guests, fine art photographer Patricia Galagan and conservationist and environmental writer William deBuys. Based in Santa Fe, Patricia photographs many subjects, but those that draw her attention most are scenes from the New Mexico landscape. She and her husband, Philip Metcalf, were artists in residence at Bandelier National Monument in 2015, where they captured many scenes. Their work has been shown at the New Mexico Museum of Art and is included in the Palace of the Governor's archives. One of Philip's photographs is currently part of the exhibition Looking Back at the New Mexico History Museum. Together, they co-authored Fire Ghosts, a photography book showcasing the aftermath of the Las Conchas Fire in 2011. They photographed within the fire's burn scar for 7 years as the forest regrew. The book includes essays by William deBuys, research ecologist Craig Allen, and New Mexico Museum of Art photo curator Catherine Ware. Fire Ghosts, published in 2019, was voted Best Nature Book in the 2020 New Mexico-Arizona Book Awards. Philip Metcalf passed away in November 2019, just 1 month after the book was published. William deBuys has authored 10 books, including The Last Unicorn, A Search for One of Earth's Rarest Creatures, A Great Aridness, Climate Change and the Future of the American West, and River of Traps, a 1991 Pulitzer finalist. His most recent book, The Trail to Canjiroba, Rediscovering Earth in an Age of Loss, is due to appear this July. He has been a Kluge Distinguished Visiting Scholar at the Library of Congress, a Guggenheim Fellow, a Lyndhurst Fellow. He was also the founding chair of the Valles Caldera Trust, responsible for administering the 89,000-acre Valles Caldera National Preserve in northern New Mexico. He lives on the farm he has tended since 1976 in the remote village of El Valle in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, and currently chairs the board of the investigative journalism nonprofit Searchlight New Mexico. Patricia will share with us why she and Philip chose to photograph the aftermath of the Las Conchas Fire and the unexpected things they learned about the future of forests in the American Southwest and other arid zones in a time of rising temperatures and increasing drought. Because they came to the project as fine art photographers, not scientists or environmentalists, William's added perspective relative to New Mexico and the environment is really valuable. They will take questions at the end of their presentation, so you're all welcome to put those in the comments. Now, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I am very pleased to introduce William deBuys.
Thank you, Laura. And hello, everyone out there. Our purpose this evening is to celebrate Fire Ghosts, a beautiful book of photography by Pat Galagan and Philip Metcalf. As Laura said, it documents the devastation and also the recovery from the Las Conchas Fire of 2011, which consumed a couple of 100,000 acres of forest in the Jemez Mountains. As I speak to you, you'll see photographs from the book gradually progressing across your screen, and I think I'm just down in a little corner there, but I hope you enjoy that arrangement and enjoy seeing the photographs as they scroll by. The Las Conchas Fire is a microcosm of what climate change promises for northern New Mexico. I'm going to talk briefly about what we might further expect, and I'll touch on a couple of different areas: water, terrestrial ecosystems, community, and what we all can do. This won't be comprehensive by any means, just a real skimming across the surface of a very large and complicated subject matter. But let me jump right in. It's important to understand here in the Southwest that even if precipitation stays steady, as the environment warms, evaporation is going to increase quite a lot. The relationship between precipitation, or between temperature and evaporation, is not a linear function. It's nonlinear, which is to say that if temperature increases just a little, evaporation increases a lot. And that means that the stresses on plants, animals, agriculture, water uses of all kinds will get a lot more extreme as time goes on, even if precipitation stays steady. But don't bet your house on that, because most models project that precipitation will decline substantially, and that surface water resources, the water flowing in our rivers, will decline precipitously over the years to come. It would seem, in fact, that that is happening around us even now. All of this means that that we can expect our world here in the Southwest to become hotter and drier. Given that we're already fully utilizing our water resources, and in many cases, draining our savings account of groundwater, practices are obviously going to have to change. One likely way that we and our communities in the Southwest will adjust to the emerging new normal will be, in many cases, to arrange for the transfer of water from agriculture to urban and industrial purposes. That sounds easy. It's not easy. But over 70% of water in New Mexico right now is used for agriculture, so there's a lot of room to work with. It won't be cheap to divert water to cities and towns and away from farm fields. It will be expensive to pay the holders of water rights for the use of that water. And those transfers, when and if they occur, will also exert huge stresses down through the economic structure of the agricultural sector to the workers who otherwise would be in the farm fields, to the equipment salesman, to the pickup truck salesman, to all the supplies and the downstream activity in that sector. Those transfers are going to cost a lot of money and be very, very complicated to work out. So that's one big concern. Another concern, even bigger, I think, is that those transfers will work where the plumbing exists to move agricultural water to the cities. Santa Fe and Albuquerque, located close to the Rio Grande and with various pipelines connecting them to the river, have the ability to receive diversions of water from agriculture. But what about cities that aren't connected to that kind of plumbing? What about Las Vegas, New Mexico, which has a very small surface watershed for its municipal water system, and that also relies on diminishing reserves of groundwater? There are many towns and cities throughout New Mexico that have that kind of delicate relationship. I don't know, my crystal ball is pretty murky on that subject. I don't know how they're going to fare. It's going to be a real challenge for such communities. And what about the needs of wildlife? As competition for water increases, it's going to be harder and harder to save out of the human economy, out of the human exchange of water, enough water to keep the springs and creeks running, to support the wildlife populations, including the endangered species that are among the most vulnerable of the critters out there. So that's going to take special attention from a lot of people to stand in protection for the diversity of the natural world. I'll jump now to the terrestrial world, away from the liquid world. Last fall, I spent a week with some friends up in the Pecos Wilderness, which I suspect everybody viewing this is more or less familiar with. Most of the high country up there in the wilderness area above Santa Fe and stretching all the way over to Las Vegas and up north almost to Taos, most of that high country is covered in forests of Engelmann spruce and alpine fir, or subalpine fir. In the course of our week up there in the high Pecos, my friends and I walked about 60 miles, and in that time, we did not see one stand of spruce and fir that had more live trees than dead ones. The mortality in some areas was 90% of the forest or more. We saw not one stand of trees that you might call healthy. I'm sorry to report that the high country looks primed for a fire even more devastating than the Las Conchas Fire. And even if there is no burn up there in that otherwise usually pretty moist environment, massive changes appear already underway. This kind of dieback in the forest is predicted by various of the models used to predict climate change. And it applies to virtually all forests in New Mexico and in the greater Southwest. These forests are going to show huge losses to insects, budworms, and bark beetles. These insects prosper as temperatures rise and as the trees on which they feed grow more dehydrated and less able to resist them. There will also be huge losses to more fires, and there will be big losses also to direct stress from heat and drought. Now, lots of times when we think about climate change and we think about temperatures rising slowly over time, we think that the ecosystems of the natural world are going to be changing at a similarly kind of steady, slow rate. Well, that may be true in many instances, but also in many instances, there are going to be big, sudden, powerful changes, like the Las Conchas Fire that the book Fire Ghosts so beautifully documents. Fires and natural diebacks of this kind can constitute what we might call type changes, where the ecosystem that existed before flips to something completely different. This has happened up in the footprint of the Las Conchas Fire, where areas that formerly were forest are now shrublands, with a lot of locust and New Mexico privet growing, covering the ground, and communities developing that are outside of the successional regime of the previous ecosystem. These are major changes of habitat. We can expect these kinds of big, powerful events also in other dimensions, in floods, in blizzards, in drought. The warmer atmosphere that we're going to get, that we are getting, that's already taking form around us, because it's warmer, we'll have more energy. It'll be more powerful. It'll have the ability to do things that are much more dramatic than in the past. It will be like an athlete on steroids. And so we can expect more records to be set, more outside the envelope performances. My advice, one of the items, cultivate a love of the desert. There's going to be a lot more of it. about communities. The stress of climate change is going to put people in motion. People from hard-pressed places are going to move toward places that are less hard-pressed, whether we're talking in environmental terms or economic terms. This will include both people who struggle to feed themselves and people who have means, who move from place to place in search of the most pleasant surroundings. Again, my crystal ball is too cloudy to predict how this kind of movement of people will affect us here in northern New Mexico, but it will affect us. I'd like to point out in this context that we can anticipate more of climate change by looking at the dynamics of the coronavirus. The two phenomena follow parallel patterns. The virus moving just a lot faster than climate change. The pattern begins with the same denial and division. It moves on through impacts on people and communities that are markedly unequal, always worse for the poor, always revealing great social inequities. To deal with the effects of climate change, we're going to have to deal with the systems that produce the greenhouse gas pollution. We're also going to have to deal with the systems that sustain those inequities. Everything is connected. Looking down the road, I want to share with you an anecdote. Years ago, probably more than 10 years ago, down in Las Cruces, I attended a talk by the great environmental activist and writer Bill McKibben, founder of 350.org. He was giving a talk at NMSU, and the talk was about climate change. At the end of the talk, he answered questions, and at the end of the Q&A, he stuck around, and various people clustered around him to ask more questions. One lady came up to him. I was just listening in. She said, "Okay, Mr. McKibben, you've convinced me about climate change. So what do we do to protect ourselves?" And Bill's answer was, "Live in a strong community." And the woman then asked the logical follow-up question, how do you find a strong community? And Bill shot back, "You don't. You build it." I can't think of a better way of describing the direction we need to head in here in Greater Santa Fe, in whatever community you're in, throughout the West, throughout the nation. So in terms of action, in terms of what we can do, obviously there's good news. We just elected a new president. We've got a new administration coming in that's prioritizing its response to climate change. And those changes brought by that administration is probably going to increase the traction for all of our individual efforts, no matter where we apply them. So that's good. Also good is that the scientific consensus about climate change, about one particular feature of climate change, has shifted. It now appears that once global emissions are brought under control, the climate will stabilize relatively quickly, rather than in a time frame of generations, which was previously thought. This prospect should inspire us all to press ahead even more hopefully and decisively in the months and years ahead. It goes without saying that we should all strive to reduce our carbon footprints, and also that we should all be politically active, not just to advance the needed environmental policies, but also to achieve the social change that must accompany them. I pray that a spirit of community progress and not NIMBYism will prevail. NIMBYism, as most of you know, comes from the acronym NIMBY, not in my backyard. NIMBYism is just protecting your own little patch without thinking about the good of everyone around you. That's something we're going to have to overcome. The opportunities for getting involved through volunteerism are unlimited with nonprofits, with social programs in your community. Just dive in. In general, we all need to contribute to the building of the strong community that Bill McKibben was talking about. And we also need to take care of ourselves. We need to take time out to shed the stresses, to appreciate the world around us, and take inspiration from the glorious land in which we live. We need to absorb the beauty, which, as Pat will now describe, exists and grows even in the wake of devastating events like the Las Conchas Fire. So now, Pat, please come forward and tell us more.
Thank you, Bill, and hello, everyone. I am going to talk about absorbing the beauty. I'm going to tell you, you have been seeing some photographs while Bill was speaking, but I want to tell you more about what is in the book. Philip and I were frequently asked, what kind of book is Fire Ghosts? So I'm going to go into a bit of detail about what's actually in the book. It was named Best Nature Book by the New Mexico and Arizona booksellers, and it is indeed a nature book, but it is primarily a photography book. It's the vision of two visual artists, but there's also some science and some history in it, which I'll tell you about in a minute. One of the reviewers, Stephen Pine, who is the author of Between Two Fires, A Fire History of Contemporary America, he called Fire Ghost a gripping poster for the pyrocene. I want to tell you some things that it's not. It's not a scientific documentation of a fire. There's no smoke, no flames, no fire jumpers, no helicopters dropping fire retardant, no before and after of particular trees or areas. It is about the aftermath of the fire, the period immediately following, and then the next 7 years when it began to grow back, although growing back's not a really accurate term for what happened because it didn't grow back as it was before. And it is primarily about the effects of climate change on a forest. It's a way of seeing it, a way of appreciating some of the things that Bill has been telling you. So for starters, there are two portfolios. Philip and I each have 35 photos in the book. Philip's is called Forest Elegy. He works in black and white. You've seen a lot of his so far. He worked with a camera that was converted to capture the infrared spectrum, and that's what gives his photos a stark, dramatic look. And it's very appropriate since he was covering the destruction. My portfolio is called The Green Fuse, and that's taken from a poem by Dylan Thomas, the first line of which is, "The force that through the green fuse drives the flower." And I called it that because my photos are about what happened in the subsequent 7 years when things began to appear. I started with photographs that I desaturated, and then I brought back just the color of things that were reappearing. The book also contains an excellent essay by Bill. He covers the history of land management in the Jemez at the time and the competing interests of people who were there for timber or grazing or recreation. And he really paints a picture of the community. That's clearly a theme then and now. And since there are no pictures of the fire itself in the book, but Bill's essay contains a really compelling description of what it was like. to watch the fire, which burned, as many people know, for more than 30 days. There's also an essay by Craig D. Allen. He's a research ecologist who has spent 40 years doing research in the Jemez about tree mortality related to climate change and drought. One of the most important things he said in the book, after a lot of discussion, that the Las Conchas Fire, which was the biggest fire in New Mexico at the time, was a harbinger of much hotter, larger fires to come. And we certainly saw that. California was burning, Alaska, Australia, and of course, California. And then there's also an essay by Catherine Ware, who's the curator of photography at the New Mexico Museum of Art. She's the author of a book called Earth Now, which is about how American photographers have documented the landscape. She writes about the role of nature photography used to be to show people what was beautiful and needed to be preserved. Now it's much more about the influence of man on the landscape and the environment. Some people, I know many of you know where the fire was, but for those of you who are not familiar with New Mexico, I'm going to talk a little bit about where we took the photos. In the book, there is a hand-drawn map of the burn scar of the Las Conchas Fire by Santa Fe artists Carol and Tony Florek. And the fire itself was located more or less in north-central New Mexico. And it's between two places that are known for explosions. One is Los Alamos, where the atomic bomb was developed, and on the west side of the burn scar is the Valles Caldera, which is a supervolcano that's a million years old. The footprint from north to south is roughly 35 miles long and about 25 miles wide at its widest point. And it burned almost 159,000 acres in 31 days before it was contained. It burned part of the St. Peter's Dome Wilderness, part of Bandelier National Monument, and parts of two Native American pueblos, Santa Clara in the north and Cochiti Pueblo in the south. So people often ask, why did you photograph something so awful as a forest fire? In fact, Kate Ware asked us once, she said, "Why are you taking pictures of dead trees?" Well, the truth is it was impossible to ignore. If you lived in the Jemez, in the Sangres near Santa Fe or the environs where you could see Los Alamos, it was like theater seating. You could see the clouds of smoke in the daytime reaching up thousands and thousands of feet into the air, and at night you could see flare-ups of places that were burning at night. There were hot spots. It was so compelling. It was hard not to watch because it was so ever present. So the thing that really drew us to go up and photograph the fire was, honestly, it was visual curiosity. We wanted to know what something that was very familiar to us looked like after it had been burned. We used to go up to a short trail about 3 miles that went to the north rim of Cochiti Canyon. And it was a mixture of ponderosa pine, aspen trees. It was a very pleasant walk. That was the first place we went. And our immediate reaction was just incredible shock and sadness. Any notion that we had of what a forest should be like, look like, smell like, it was gone. It was a gray wasteland. It was a palette of black and gray. There was ash everywhere. We were wading through ash. It was silent. There were no animals. it was incredibly shocking to see the change. And about a month into the fire, it was finally deemed that it was controlled, and we went up immediately to try to take some pictures. And the minute we pulled over by the side of the road, the forest rangers would come and ask us to leave. But eventually we were allowed to go in, and we were hooked. We started exploring different parts of the burn scar. We actually traded our city car for a Toyota FJ Cruiser. It's a big square car with knobby tires so that we could go on the back roads. And it had a winch on the front in case we ever got stuck. We never did. We equipped it with some axes and saws because often we would come across trees in the road. First aid kit, water, space blankets, and then in the fall, we would add orange vests so that no hunters would mistake us for elk or deer. So for the next 7 years, in all seasons, we went sometimes once a week, sometimes 2 or 3 times a week. We just kept going and exploring. And about year 4, we decided to do the book. We didn't first go with the idea of doing a book. That took a while to evolve. So people also often asked us, what did we learn from making the photos and doing the book? I think in many ways it was fortunate. We certainly knew that there were forest fires in New Mexico, but really we were forest fire virgins. We were a tabula rasa. We didn't have any preconceived notions about what a fire should do or what should happen in the forest afterwards. We were starting from scratch, but we wanted to know about fire behavior, the regrowth patterns. Would the forest return to its former self? At first we thought so, because after a few days of rain, things began to emerge. And for a while, for that first year afterwards, we felt somewhat hopeful. But the more we learned, the wiser we became. One of the things we started with, we read Bill's book, A Great Aridness, about climate change in the American Southwest. We talked with Craig Allen, and he spent lots and lots of time telling us about New Mexico fire behavior historically and going forward in the future. And it was he who really convinced us that this fire was a harbinger. And he coined the phrase, the forest was going to have a shrubbier future. And that's confirmed by the photos. You can see there are fewer aspens, very, very few ponderosa pines, but lots of gamble oak, locust, and low flowers, shrubs, and grasses. So the obvious conclusion after a few years was that the forest that was growing back was not the one that had been burned. There would be no going back to normal, and that has become more and more true going forward. The Las Conchas Fire really foreshadowed the future of forests, not just here, but places that are where old growth trees are threatened by drought and heat. So our intent was to show what happens after the smoke and flames are gone, and the effects of climate change begin to show up. So I think now we're ready for questions.
All right, thank you, Patricia, to our wonderful Facebook audience out there with us. Any questions or comments for our 2 speakers? Please go ahead and type those into the comments. So Patricia, what projects are you currently working on? Is this something that you continue to focus on as a subject matter?
Well, I still I do still return to the footprint of the fire because I continue to be curious about how it is changing over time. And in fact, about 3 months ago, my sons and I scattered Philip's ashes into Cochiti Canyon, which was his request. So yes, I do go back. But he and I had actually started a second project about drought. We called it Dry and Drier, and so I'm continuing to work on that.
It's wonderful, Patricia. How beautiful! What a beautiful way to honor his contribution to the work. Are there any photographers that inspire you, that influence your work on this type of project?
There are a number of them. Ansel Adams, obviously. Anybody who takes black and white photography in the American West, really, it's inevitable that you'll be influenced in some way by Ansel Adams. Also a British photographer, Michael Kenna. His work is very spare, very dramatic, beautifully composed. And Sebastião Salgado, who takes beautiful pictures of terrible situations.
It's all really important, I think, to document those things.
Mm-hmm.
And I, for one, I can't wait to go check out your book, Fire Ghosts, and get a little closer look at these, because they're beautiful in their devastation. And so I'm really glad that you did that work on them.
Thank you.
Do you have any recommendations for people out there, professional or amateur photographers who might be interested in landscape photography, maybe particularly this type? Because I think it's really important, as you mentioned, with our changing climate and landscape, to document these changes. What would you recommend? What would you say to them?
There are a couple things. To go back to Ansel Adams, he said the best way to take a good photograph, the most important thing you can do is know where you want to stand. And the other piece of advice I often give to people who are photographing the landscape came from Sam Abel, a National Geographic photographer. His rule is compose in layers starting from the back. So those are my two pieces of advice. I guess the other is people are often somewhat obsessed by the equipment that they use for photography. I think my advice is get to know your equipment so that it's a tool, so that you're not busy thinking about any of the technical issues. You're just involved in the image that you're looking for.
Absolutely, wonderful advice. What about logistical things, like if they're looking to take photos on private land or national park land? What does the process look like to be able to take photos in some of these areas in New Mexico?
You sometimes need permission. Sometimes you can trespass, but you really need to respect the land and people's property rights and ownership. Some people don't want their areas photographed, but there is so much that's available in New Mexico, it's really not a problem. I mean, there are just vast amounts of beautiful places to take pictures.
So just something to think about and always proceed with respect in these beautiful New Mexican landscapes. We have a couple of questions coming in from our audience. Hillary asks for Patricia, have you photographed any other fires in New Mexico?
Yes, I photographed the Medio fire earlier this year. I went up there probably 10 or 12 times from different angles and photographed it under different conditions.
Will that be a future book of yours as well?
I don't think so.
We have another question from Shelley, who's a teacher, and she's trying to connect the shared human experience to climate change with her students. Shelley, that's a wonderful thing to do. She asks, what advice do you have to students as they discuss bearing witness to our environmental challenges and impacts?
I think this is a question for Bill.
And it's a really hard question. I think our environmental predicament is especially difficult for young people because they're coming into a world that's not as stable as the world that we older people have known. We older people have done a bad job with our stewardship, frankly. But here's the deal with climate change. There's no bottom limit to how bad things can get. So it's really imperative to fix things as quickly as possible. And this item that I mentioned a little while ago, that this consensus is now that as soon as we bring global emissions down, the world climate will stabilize relatively quickly. That is extremely hopeful. So I think the best thing for young folks to focus on is just being really committed to getting this thing stabilized, getting it fixed, supporting the efforts in those directions, and along the way, learning really to enjoy the beauty of the natural world. That's one of the most restorative and most sustaining things that any person can do in his or her life. And it will inspire all the rest of the work that needs to be done.
That's wonderful, and thank you. I think you're absolutely right. Right, spot on there. As they say, there's a quote that I like. I'm not sure who says it, but we don't so much inherit the world from our ancestors, we sort of borrow it from our children. So I think you're right about educating ourselves and then being committed together to make those positive changes. Another question from our audience here, of course, the main question of the evening is, where can we purchase this wonderful book? Where can we learn more?
In Santa Fe, there are 3 places: Collected Works Bookstore,
Get close to the mic.
Garcia Street Books, and Photo Eye Bookstore and Gallery. And it's also on Amazon.
Shh.
Wonderful.
But just to reiterate that, the first store mentioned was Collected Works, which has been a great friend of the book all the way along.
Yes.
Wonderful. And Patricia and William have provided us with a couple of websites that we can add into the comments here on the post, so our audience can investigate a little further. William, I have a question for you. I think Patricia touched a little bit on it, and the landscape was just so dramatically altered after the Las Conchas Fire from an ecological, environmental perspective. Will it ever really return to the way it was, or with something this devastating, are there certain species of plant life that never really come back?
In general, in an awful lot of areas, what we're going to see are landscapes that weren't there before. Not even landscapes that were there before in previous successional stages. We're, in many areas, going to be moving into completely new arrangements of the land, new systems of plants and animals. And so, in a way, this is somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but if you happen to be one of those human beings, and I include myself in this, who like to look at and study changes in the land, well, we all have been born into the best time to be alive since at least the end of the Pleistocene, and maybe much farther back than that, because things are changing now so rapidly. But if you're also part of another group, in which I also include myself, of people who become very attached to specific landscapes and the specific look, the specific beauty of a certain place, then you have to be prepared for heartache, because those places are likely to change. And, you know, any act of love always involves eventually some kind of loss. And so it is with loving the land.
Absolutely. Thank you, William. We have a lovely comment here for the both of you from one of our audience members. Dawn says, thank you so much for the beautiful photography, the information, and the presentation. Are there any more questions or comments from our audience? All
Here,
right.
come closer, we can just...
Well, I think we about covered it.
Yes.
Thank you again so much, Patricia and William, for that wonderful and very informative and inspiring presentation. We very much here at Las Golondrinas, our audience, we very much appreciate you being part of our Speaking of Traditions virtual winter lecture series. And again, we thank our wonderful audience here on Facebook Live for your continued support, for always logging into our programs. Once again, Fire Ghost is available at Santa Fe Collected Works, Photo Eye Gallery and Bookstore, and at Garcia Street Books. As I mentioned, we do have a couple of websites for more information that we'll put into the body of the comments there for you all. Just want to remind our viewers that our second and third talks of this winter lecture series are scheduled for Tuesday, February 23rd, and Tuesday, March 30th, both at 6 p.m. Suppose I should get here in the camera.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody, for tuning in, and stay safe and be well.
And enjoy the forests while they last.
Exactly. I second that. Again, thank you all so much for being part of this. So again, folks, our audience, again, thank you so much for tuning in to us for our first of our winter lecture series, coming to you virtually right here from El Rancho de las Golondrinas. Again, a reminder, and we'll put these on our Facebook, on Tuesday, February 23rd is our second lecture, and on Tuesday, March 30th, those will both be at 6 p.m. broadcasted right here on our Facebook Live. Please share with your friends and family. We're also lining up our 2021 Golondrinas Live Session series. It'll be coming back, which features New Mexico traditions and lifeways. So make sure to look for those event details on our Facebook page. And of course, for all things Golondrinas, please follow us on Instagram at SF Golondrinas. Subscribe to the Las Golondrinas channel on YouTube, and visit us at golondrinas.org. If you have any questions or comments after this presentation, go ahead and put those right into the body of the comments on the post. Again, please share with your friends and family. Let anybody that doesn't have a Facebook or Instagram know that they can visit us on our website. They can subscribe to our newsletter. They can find us on YouTube. And hopefully later this year, we'll be able to all come together again right here at Las Golondrinas. But in the meantime, wishing you all a safe and lovely evening. Thank you so much.